By 3:15 a.m., the sky above Kuwait had turned almost completely black. Somewhere near the border, an old and nearly forgotten silhouette slipped through a narrow blind spot in the regional radar picture. It was not a modern stealth aircraft. It was not a next-generation platform. It was a Cold War-era fighter, upgraded just enough to become dangerous again, moving low, quiet, and almost invisible against the noise of the Persian Gulf. For a few critical minutes, the regional defense network did not see a clear threat. It saw only a faint, unstable track, something too uncertain to classify, too close to civilian movement to respond to immediately, and too brief to ignore completely. Then the night changed. A sudden impact shook the area near a sensitive facility, sending smoke and heat rising into the desert air. Within moments, warning systems across the region shifted into emergency mode. Command centers lit up, operators leaned closer to their screens. What had first appeared as a weak signal had become a very real problem. A small, outdated aircraft had just slipped through one of the most advanced defense networks in the region. And that was the point. Tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran had already been rising after a series of back-and-forth military moves. In response, Tehran decided to make a bold and symbolic move of its own. Instead of relying on its most advanced systems, it chose something unexpected: the upgraded F-5E Tiger II, known in Iranian service as the Kawsar. On paper, the aircraft looked old. In practice, under the right conditions, it became difficult to identify. Flying low over the sea, blending into surface clutter, civilian air traffic, and heavy maritime movement, it could create confusion at exactly the wrong moment. At 3:20 a.m., a lone Kawsar lifted off from southern Iran and immediately descended to an extremely low altitude. It crossed the Persian Gulf just above the surface, staying close to the waves and using the natural radar horizon to hide its movement. Above the region, an E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft continued its patrol, scanning the airspace. On the ground, Kuwaiti sensors watched their assigned sectors. But between the angles, the altitude, the sea surface, and the crowded traffic picture, a narrow opening appeared. The Kawsar moved through it. To increase the confusion, Iran filled the surrounding airspace with Shahed drones and misleading radar signatures. The purpose was not simply to create pressure. It was to force commanders to divide their attention across multiple tracks, each one requiring time, verification, and caution. For several minutes, the F-5E moved almost like a ghost through the gaps. Then it climbed. The aircraft emerged over the desert and released its unguided payload toward the outer logistics area of Camp Buehring. The impact disrupted communication lines, damaged fuel storage areas, and pushed the entire base into a chaotic emergency posture. As the Kawsar turned back toward the sea, Iranian state media began presenting the event as a historic success against the American defensive shield. But the story was far from over. At 3:32 a.m., immediately after the incident at Camp Buehring, the regional air defense network shifted into a full tactical response posture. The E-3 Sentry AWACS expanded its tracking zone, stretching coverage across Kuwaiti airspace and the northern Persian Gulf while directing rapid response aircraft toward the suspected corridor. F-35A, Lightning II fighters, and F-15E Strike Eagles, already operating in nearby combat air patrol zones, were redirected toward the area. They formed a layered aerial containment pattern at different altitudes, designed to close possible escape routes without creating unnecessary risk for civilian traffic. At the same time, an MQ-9 Reaper already flying an intelligence and surveillance mission west of Kuwait became a key part of the response. From high altitude, it maintained steady observation, tracking heat signatures and movement patterns, while streaming real-time data back to command centers and incoming aircraft. This meant U.S. forces were no longer simply asking where the aircraft was. They were beginning to predict where it would go next. After releasing its payload, the Iranian F-5E dropped back to low altitude and headed toward the Persian Gulf. It stayed close to the water, using sea surface masking and the dense traffic of civilian vessels and tankers to complicate tracking. Its radar signature became distorted, mixed into a field of surrounding contacts and reflections. The aircraft was not invisible, but it was difficult to classify with enough confidence for an immediate response. During the first phase of the pursuit, the F-35A repeatedly received strong targeting cues from fused AWACS and MQ-9 data. But detection was not the same as clearance to act. The aircraft remained close to civilian air corridors and busy maritime lanes, forcing U.S. forces to track carefully instead of rushing the decision. The pursuit became a high-stakes balance between speed and caution. At 3:45 a.m., the area around Camp Buehring was covered by a thick curtain of smoke and heat. The burning logistics zone created a messy thermal background, making traditional infrared tracking harder in the first critical moments. Hot surfaces, scattered debris, and moving aircraft all began to blend together into a chaotic picture. But the U.S. response did not depend on a single sensor. the F-35A shifted deeper into its sensor fusion role. Its distributed aperture system, a full 360-degree infrared camera network built around the aircraft, began separating the battlefield into layers of movement, heat, direction, and speed. The system was not simply looking through smoke. It was building a real-time map of the entire environment and identifying which signals behaved like aircraft, which signals belonged to the ground, and which ones were only temporary background noise. Inside that dense field, one small but consistent moving signature began to stand out: the F-5E, withdrawing low over the sea. By combining data from the F-35A, AWACS, and MQ-9, U.S. forces established a stable track from behind the smoke-filled zone. For the first time since the beginning of the incident, the aircraft was no longer just a suspicious contact. It had been clearly confirmed. The Iranian pilots seemed to understand that the aircraft was being followed. The Khazar began low-altitude evasive maneuvers, staying close to the sea and repeatedly changing direction in an attempt to break the tracking solution. Each turn forced the pursuing aircraft and command systems to refresh their calculations. The chase became fragmented, unstable, and highly technical. But the F-5E was no longer enjoying the same advantage it had during the opening minutes. Its speed began to fall, and its escape margins slowly narrowed as fused sensor tracking became more reliable. Recognizing that the aircraft was losing its initial edge, Iran escalated its support effort. Along the southern coastline, electronic warfare stations began broadcasting shifting radar patterns with changing frequencies and power levels. These created layers of false emitters across the same operational space. At the same time, drone decoys were sent along multiple routes. These low-cost unmanned aircraft were not there to cause major physical damage. Their job was to imitate parts of the real aircraft's radar behavior and pull attention away from the true track. The false routes were designed to cross civilian air corridors and crowded maritime zones. This turned the low-altitude battle space into a congested environment where every contact had to be checked, compared, and checked again. By 3:53 a.m., the fuse display of the U.S. Air Defense Network began showing overlapping layers of interference. Some tracks appeared for only seconds. Others remained long enough to look credible. The system could not simply ignore them because one of them might have been the real aircraft. This was exactly what Iran wanted. But instead of collapsing into confusion, the F-35A became the center of the data network. Information from AWACS, MQ-9, and ground-based radar systems was synchronized in real time. Each contact was evaluated based on stability, flight path, speed, altitude, and motion behavior. The F-15E Strike Eagle moved into a lower altitude intercept posture, ready to respond if the primary aircraft separated from civilian traffic and entered a clearer engagement area. At this point, the situation was no longer a simple chase. It had become a real-time identification challenge. Every radar return, every false signal, and every drone route had to be measured against the behavior of the real aircraft. Then Iran increased the pressure again. Shed 136 drones were launched from multiple locations, flying along uneven routes and creating simultaneous pressure across the entire U.S. defense picture. The purpose was no longer only to hide the F-5E. It was to stretch the sensor network, force processing delays, and make the pursuit corridor harder to maintain. For a short period, the airspace over Kuwait and the surrounding maritime zone became heavily saturated. Low-flying drones, electronic interference, sea reflections, and civilian movement all merged into one complex operational picture. On the shared display, the number of contacts rose sharply while the reliability of each individual track dropped. Systems had to reclassify contacts every few seconds, but the U.S. network adjusted quickly. The F-35A continued acting as the central data distribution node, pushing real-time target information across connected aircraft and ground systems. Instead of each platform working alone, the entire force began operating from a shared picture. F-15E Strike Eagles, ground-based air defense units, AWACS, and MQ-9 surveillance all contributed to the same layered view. Every contact was assigned a threat probability and priority level based on fused data from multiple sources. At 4:05 a.m., the F-15E was positioned for a low-altitude intercept, waiting for the F-5E to separate from civilian corridors. Ground-based systems no longer acted as isolated units. They received direct data from the F-35A and AWACS, allowing engagement decisions to be synchronized in real time. Above the area, the MQ-9 Reaper maintained steady observation of the entire withdrawal corridor. Ground radar became less central, while airborne and fused systems took control of the wider picture. In this environment, the Shahed swarm did not produce the decisive result Iran had hoped for. Instead, it became another data layer that the U.S. system began sorting in real time. What was meant to overwhelm the network gradually became a computational challenge, and the advantage began shifting back toward the side with stronger sensor fusion. The final F-5E eventually broke out of the immediate pursuit area and approached Iranian airspace. To Tehran, this looked like a symbolic success. A Cold War-era aircraft had entered a modern US-backed defense environment, carried out its mission, and returned. But the United States still did not respond immediately. The F-35A and MQ-9 continued tracking the aircraft, deliberately allowing it to complete its return path. The reason was simple. The aircraft itself had become more valuable as a source of information than as a single target. Its route revealed the shape of Iran's penetration corridor. Its evasive pattern revealed the support network behind it. Every electronic signal, drone route, relay point, and radar corridor helped U.S. analysts build a clearer map of the entire operation. At that moment, the F-5E was no longer just an aircraft escaping home. It was a moving data source. Throughout the return flight, information from Kausar's path was fused with AWACS, F-35A, MQ-9, and ground-based radar inputs. Slowly, the larger picture came together. Radar corridors, relay stations, drone coordination points, and electronic support nodes began appearing inside the U.S. operational map. By the time the F-5E returned safely, the next phase had already begun. U.S. naval platforms in the Gulf launched long-range precision systems toward coastal Iranian support sites. Radar corridors, relay stations, and drone coordination centers were targeted in a coordinated response. At the same time, F-35A and F-15E aircraft carried out precision suppression operations against the support nodes that had enabled the original penetration. Cyber operations added another layer, disrupting command and control systems and weakening the coordination structure behind Iran's earlier move. The architecture that had helped the F-5E pass through the defense network began to unravel piece by piece. The key lesson from that night was not that one aircraft had outsmarted an entire defense system. It was that modern air defense is no longer built around a single radar, a single aircraft, or a single command post. It is a fused network where every sensor adds to a larger picture. Iran believed the smoke and confusion over Camp Buehring would blind U.S. forces. What it did not realize was that the F-35A had already begun tracking the F-5E before the aircraft fully emerged from the chaos. Tehran proved that even an older fighter can create serious problems when used creatively and at the right moment. But creating disruption is not the same as controlling the outcome. Iran believed it had outplayed the United States with outdated hardware. In reality, the United States was operating a fully integrated command and sensor network, one that could absorb confusion, separate real signals from false ones, and turn the enemy's escape route into a map for the next move.